Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the annual conference on cyber norms. Today we are joined for our keynote by Milton Mueller. Milton, welcome. So glad you could make it. Milton is a professor at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, the United States, which is now one of the most famous states in the United States. We all know where it is now. Working in the School of Public Policy, and he's an eminent scholar in the field of internet governance and the technical aspects of it. I think I just realized that one of the advantages of doing this online is that instead of having a jet-lagged American professor, we now have someone who has risen fairly recently. I think it's 10 o'clock where you are now, Milton, so that would be good. We're nearing the end of our day, so we're very happy to have a crisp speaker who is going to take us to the next level, hopefully. You have done an amazing amount of work. I'm just going to mention a few of your books, which should be on bookshelves with most of the people tuning in, I would say. Lately, Will the Internet Fragment? Sovereignty, Globalization, and Cyberspace, which was one of the reasons we really wanted you to speak at a conference with the title we have carried today. But also, of course, Networks and States and Ruling the Root are, I would say, classics by now. So we are very happy that you could join us. We're also very happy with what you are going to be doing for us. You're going to take, you sort of depart from the analysis you made in that book, Will the Internet Fragment, which was published late 2016. Cyber years are always eventful, but I think the years since 2016 have been very eventful in terms of polarization, in terms of perhaps fragmentation, but I'm going to leave that to you. I'm going to ask you to take the floor. So far, we've had a very interesting and very lively debates in this conference. So you will be speaking for roughly 40 minutes, I think. And we'll have 20 minutes for Q&A. The Q&A for everybody who's listening in, who's here for the first time, there is a button on the left, sorry, on the right hand of your bar, the two speech bubbles with the question marks in it. You can put your question in there. Please do this with your name. We do not take anonymous questions. And then you can upload your question during the talk, and we'll get to these questions when Milton is done. So Milton, the floor is all yours. I expect you want to upload, you want to share screen with your slides?
So yeah, I am sorry that I could not attend all of the conference because it seems like everybody there was talking about some of the same issues that I'll be talking about. So it would have been interesting to hear about what was being said. But essentially, I want to talk today about, I can sum up my points in one sentence here. And that is that states are competing for sovereignty in cyberspace, but there's no sovereignty to be had there. So that competition for the impossible is pushing states in one of two directions, towards national digital islands or towards a single global sovereign that will disempower other states and most users and suppliers on the internet. Meanwhile, this competition for sovereignty is doing severe damage to the internet. Of course, there is no such thing as the internet. Take that term as shorthand for something much bigger and more important: the human capability to communicate at will with anyone in the world. This includes the personal freedom to associate online and to access and use vast stores of information, as well as the economic freedom to choose a diverse, interoperable, and affordable set of information technology devices, applications, and services. By competing for sovereignty in cyberspace, states are threatening these benefits. But as I said before, there is no sovereignty to be had there. So this living contradiction explains a lot about what is happening in internet governance and cyber diplomacy today. So let's back up a bit. As Dennis mentioned, 4 years ago, I wrote a book that asked, will the internet fragment? Since then, there have been three critically important developments relevant to its theme. There has been a renewed data governance conflicts between the US and Europe. There has been a massive fracture between the United States and China in terms of the digital economy. And there has been a major backlash against social media, which is very different from the rosy projections of how it was viewed just 4 or 5 years ago. Now, let me first summarize the argument I made in Will the Internet Fragment, and then I'll try to fit these arguments into this framework and see how these current events fit into it. It was, of course, the Snowden revelations that triggered the contemporary debate about internet fragmentation. Many in the international arena saw these revelations as an open admission that the United States' dominance of the internet and its infrastructure was being used for military and intelligence advantage. The whole idea of a free and open internet took a big hit. Some responded with calls for data localization or some form of, quote, technological sovereignty or a national internet. The response from defenders of the internet, again that term, was that they were fragmenting or balkanizing the internet. We then started to have a very interesting debate about what the heck a fragmented internet actually means. Some people said it was about blocking content, others talked about incompatible applications, others talked about geo-blocking or alternate DNS routes. Some people even said language differences and the digital divide were forms of internet fragmentation. My book tried to break out of this dead end by developing a technically grounded definition of what it would mean to fragment the internet. That was hard to do, in fact, because as a decentralized system of tens of thousands of independently managed networks, one could easily say that the internet was already fragmented. So I argued that it was layer 3 compatibility that made the internet not fragmented. That is, the basic internet protocol was the lingua franca that held the network of networks together. Now, IP resides at what we call the network layer, which maps onto layer 3 in the OSI reference model. And layer 3 compatibility has proven to be a very powerful and very durable thing. Following this line of analysis, the only thing that would qualify as a fragmented internet would be an internet that no longer had a globally unified layer 3. It would have to split the world between 2 or more different and incompatible layer 3 protocols that would actually prevent people who wanted to communicate from communicating. Now, it was clear 4 years ago that this was not happening, quite the opposite. Not only is internet protocol still the world's dominant data communication protocol, it is expanding to all kinds of new devices and services. We are so stuck in the original internet protocol that we can barely manage to upgrade to a newer version with a larger address space. So I think we can say universal layer 3 connectivity is intact. So does that mean all is well? I don't think it does. Something is happening, and it is not good. Frustrated by the interdependence of cyberspace, governments are trying to assert some of their authority over it, or what they think is their little piece of it. Alignment, not fragmentation, is the correct term for that process. By alignment, I mean the attempt to make authority over the internet match up with authority over legal jurisdictions at the national level. So states don't really know how to do this. They get some leverage by using their power over organizations located in their jurisdiction. They can, to some extent, regulate ISPs and social media platforms. But despite all these efforts, there is still massive levels of interdependence with what other states do. The open nature of the protocols and the global standards that make things interoperable allow for relatively limited control over what happens when those users and suppliers are connected. So since publishing Will the Internet Fragment, I explored the concepts of sovereignty in cyberspace more deeply. I published a new paper developing arguments about the relationship between sovereignty and cyberspace in International Studies Review a few months ago. Now, I think sovereignty is a concept that needs to be rescued from international law. I think they work with some kind of dead and even mummified version of it. Most of what they say about its application to the cyber domain is technically correct, but totally useless for solving today's governance problems. In fact, most international lawyers steeped in sovereignty doctrine have no idea how to apply the concept to cyberspace, other than to point out endlessly that the physical layer devices can be assigned to a territory. It is much more helpful to look at sovereignty historically and dynamically. In European history, we can best describe sovereignty as the consolidation of power on a larger geographic scale and the separation of religious authority, which was not territorial, from political authority, which increasingly was. Sovereignty achieved economies of scale in governance. Instead of many small princes in small areas with unclear relations constantly shifting, it established a single hierarchical authority over a wider territory. And that territory was more reflective of the geographic scope of transportation, communication, and commerce. Its emergence in practice was greatly aided by the Reformation, which undermined the monopoly of the Catholic Church. Now, for these new relations to form, there had to be a supportive ideology for sovereignty, or theory, if you will. The people, the church, other princes, all had to understand and come to accept the new conception of power. And of course, that theory started to emerge in the 16th century with Baudin. Initially, sovereignty was an entirely authoritarian and absolutist concept. It was used to rationalize the supremacy and exclusivity of a monarch. With the liberal democratic revolutions, the holder of sovereignty was radically changed. It was no longer an individual designated king, but the people. This magical transformation was performed, according to theorists, by that moment in the founding of a republic wherein the popular will takes the form of a constitution. Democracy delegated supreme authority to the people through a set of rules that defined how they would govern themselves on an ongoing basis. But the people typically were ones who lived in a circumscribed territory for the most part. And even then, there was a mismatch between those geographic boundaries of the collectivity and the linguistic, cultural, and religious distributions. And these conflicts still plague us today. A dynamic historical perspective on sovereignty makes it clear how plastic and evolving the notion is. Another thing you learn from the historical perspective is that several domains, notably the high seas, have been exempted from territorial sovereignty for most of human history. And of course, there are treaties and other things exempting new domains, such as outer space, from specific claims of sovereignty. Now, sovereignty means clear territorial boundaries around monopolies on the use of force. It is clear that cyberspace sunders those two key elements of it, territory and power. The virtual territory of cyberspace does not map onto geographic territory. Its physical layer of computers and networks cannot completely avoid territorial authority, of course. But when the physical layer devices are connected and interoperating, they are participating continuously in a global virtual space that is not under any state's complete control. It is, in fact, a global commons. A number of things had to combine to create this unique situation of a global virtual space. One of the most critical is that the internet protocols are open source software, appropriable by anyone. And so are its other basic standards documents. Additionally, its unique identifiers, such as names and addresses, are administered by a transnational, non-governmental institutions that try to do bottom-up multi-stakeholder governance in a non-sovereign context. The liberalization of telecommunication services and equipment in the 90s also created a transnational market for information and communication services. And that was also a major factor in the evolution of the internet as a global commons. So while physical devices can be assigned to a territory, their interactions across networks in a software-defined virtual space cannot be so easily assigned. And this creates all kinds of problems for territorial sovereignty as an institution. The idea of the world divided into these distinct, clearly bounded political units just doesn't work. Alignment is a paradox, a contradiction. Efforts to achieve it are both inevitable and impossible. It's inevitable because states will be states. They are the biggest, most powerful actors in the global political economy. Sovereignty defines their very essence, and they're not going to cede supreme power to alternative institutions without a fight. But alignment is also unattainable. Territorial sovereignty is simply not compatible with the open, non-proprietary standards and default global interoperability created by the internet. Currently, cyberspace is formed by a huge number of independent actors, all connecting, sharing facilities, collaborating, or refusing to collaborate on a voluntary basis. They are held together by common protocols and standards developed independently of states. It is predominantly non-hierarchical network governance that holds it together. If you want to achieve sovereignty in cyberspace, you cannot leave that system in place. You must either sever all digital connections with the outside world and be the supreme ruler of a digital island, or you must fight with other states to be the one sovereign over the global arena. Sovereignty means supreme and exclusive authority. So only a single unitary global entity could ever establish such authority over what we know to be cyberspace. Only a world state could ever have enough control over all the actors and processes and resources underpinning global cyberspace to possess what political scientists mean by sovereignty. And that means there's only room for one. Everyone else will be excluded, and perhaps this is not such an attractive option. Alternatively, one could pursue sovereignty as a digital island. That would make multiple sovereigns possible, but it sacrifices global compatibility in trade and information services. It means an exclusively national, autarkic internet. And no one really wants this, not even China and Russia. No major industrial or post-industrial economy can survive under those conditions unless it aspires to be North Korea. Connectivity is simply too valuable for any major economy to give up willingly. So any attempt by states to establish sovereignty over cyberspace is doomed to fail. And that is what I call the jurisdictional paradox. You can have sovereignty, or you can have a globally connected internet, but you can't have both. But states really want both. And there are strong political and economic forces pushing them simultaneously in both directions. Interestingly, this is a problem that doesn't fit into our normal categories about how the world works. This problem exists for authoritarian countries as well as liberal democracies. It exists for the East as well as the West. It exists for the so-called global North and the global South. The whole quest for sovereign control of communications and information is a goal which is impossible to achieve in a way that will make any sovereign satisfied. So most of the big events in internet governance that have played out since 2016 can be seen as ways in which these contradictions are playing themselves out. Let's begin with Europe and data protection. Superficially, the European attempt to impose stronger data protection law on internet businesses might look like alignment. It can be seen as an assertion of jurisdiction, even of digital sovereignty. But it isn't. Its actual effect has been, for the most part, greater globalization. Article 3(2) of the GDPR binds data controllers and processors regardless of their geographic location or statutory seat. The abandonment of territory is pretty explicit in court decisions. The European Court of Justice describes the territory of the member states as, quote, not necessarily territorial in the spatial or geographic sense, unquote, but rather as, quote, the area of exercise of the competences of the Union. And those competences, when applied to the data economy, are transnational. A few businesses in the US have chosen to detect and disallow traffic with Europe to avoid compliance with GDPR, but it is not common. Transatlantic interactions and data flows are so pervasive that most multinational US companies chose to become compliant with GDPR as a matter of course. Furthermore, laws imitating GDPR like protections were passed in non-EU countries, such as Norway, Switzerland, and Iceland. And there are imitations of GDPR protections in California, Brazil, Africa, and Southeast Asia. So you see the quote from the annual Privacy Governance Report for 2019 here, which claims that it has become a de facto global standard for privacy. Globalization was reinforced when ICANN, the non-governmental institution that regulates the supply of domain names, had to completely reform its handling of domain name registration data to be in compliance with GDPR. ICANN's reforms have greatly upset economic nationalists and intellectual property interests in the US. Some are lobbying for legislation that would impose US standards and laws on domains registered or managed in the US jurisdiction. If successful, this move would destroy ICANN as a global governance entity for domain names, creating a jurisdictionally partitioned DNS. But it is unlikely to happen, precisely because most participants in the industry and most users want DNS to be governed globally so as to maintain compatibility and lower transactions costs. The adjustment to GDPR provides a good example of the jurisdictional paradox. Efforts to assert sovereignty either lead to severing connections to a country or to the globalization of a legal jurisdiction. Whether by design or not, Europe took advantage of a situation that allowed it to achieve global rule. It worked this time, at least for now, but there are still risks of splintering. Extreme applications of GDPR could make it into a rigid data localization law. And if that happens, and it may be happening because of the Schrems decisions, then the supply of many information services could be crippled. In particular, services that connect people in different jurisdictions, such as a simple chat application, may be literally unable to function because it will be impossible to comply with more extreme forms of data localization. That could indeed push things into digital island mode. Well, long term, if GDPR becomes too much of a constraint on the capabilities of the digital economy, it will actually undermine rather than strengthen compliance with it. Privacy protection needs to focus on protecting individuals' confidentiality in the context of a global information economy. This goal must not morph into a process of micromanaging where data resides and how it can move. Now on to China. It is surprising how rapidly and thoroughly the US has, under Trump, abandoned its prior role as the leader and chief defender of global cyberspace and a liberal trading order. Initially, Trump's attack on the trading system was unilateralist and almost indiscriminate in its targeting. Canada, Europe, China, Mexico, whoever. According to Trump, we had a bad trade deal with all of them, and he was going to fix it. Eventually, Trump's protectionist economic policies were focused into a more comprehensive attack on China. The political roots of this are pretty clear to those of us here in the US. It united several constituencies, such as Republican Party nationalists, trade protectionists of both parties, the cultural rights, opponents of immigration, and the Defense Department, which has had China's growing strength under its eye for some time. The US national security establishment began to use the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US to block capital investments by Chinese firms in high-tech areas about 2 years or 3 years ago. Mainly because of ICT issues, the law describing the methods and mandate of CFIUS was recently broadened and strengthened. But this raising of barriers turned into a thoroughgoing decoupling in 2018, 2019, and this year. Almost all aspects of ICT were securitized. Chinese equipment vendors, Huawei and ZTE, were banned from North American markets. Leading US diplomats openly encouraged other countries to do the same. Sometimes allies were threatened as well as encouraged to cooperate with this effort. Aside from bans on market access, Huawei was prosecuted by the US Justice Department for violating the Iranian sanctions, for intellectual property theft, and the daughter of Huawei's CEO was arrested and jailed. As the attack on Huawei intensified, it became clear that it was more of a foreign policy issue than a cybersecurity or trade issue. Not just Huawei, but virtually all Chinese information services and ICT firms were now portrayed as agents of the Chinese state. Their purpose in selling equipment and services was not to make money, we were told, but to help the Chinese Communist Party take over the world. The decoupling was very thorough in the ICT sector. FCC licenses allowing Chinese telecom firms to operate in the US were withdrawn. A new international cable was denied landing rights. The Clean Networks Initiative openly tried to exclude Chinese products and services from the internet pathways used by the West. The attempt to ban WeChat and TikTok from the US was yet another leap in the direction of alignment and a digital island. In their efforts to block the Chinese, the US was starting to look a lot like the Chinese. But there is more. With its anti-China export control regime on integrated circuit technology, the US is taking alignment deeper into the ICT ecosystem. We're talking about a market in the hundreds of billions of dollars that sits at the core of the information sector. The industry is highly globalized and interdependent, but much of it hinges on the IPR, the intellectual property rights, and designs of US-based firms. The chip war is not a cybersecurity initiative. I think we all have to face that squarely. It is an attempt to cripple Chinese manufacturers of ICT products and indirectly retard Chinese military capabilities. It is comparable to the ban on oil and gas exports to the Japanese in 1941, an economic blockade of the sort that usually follows or leads to military hostilities. The dominance of US companies in chip supply gives the US government great leverage, but overly aggressive attempts to exploit a dependency can backfire. With chip sanctions, the US may be pissing away one of its most important economic and technological advantages in the global economy, an advantage that has served as a foundation for its economic growth for the past 50 years. All in an attempt to achieve some kind of short-term and highly speculative military advantage over China. The Chinese response has been predictable. Instead of opening their markets, they are moving to become more self-sufficient with their own mobile operating system and their own chip technology. So you see, we have, in effect, a competition for global sovereignty taking place. Did the Chinese state deserve this reaction? It's clear that China, with its Great Firewall, its market access limitation, and its one-party political monopoly, has been a leader in devising methods of alignment for the past 20 years. But it was also very interested in engagement with the global economy. It sheltered its huge national market, but encouraged incoming foreign capital and technology transfer. American companies such as Apple or Microsoft were let in. As its digital economy matured, it looked forward to the global expansion of domestic companies such as Huawei and Alibaba. The accusation of information age mercantilism has more than a grain of truth, but a rational response to this problem would have been to handle it as a trade issue, not a national security issue. The crackdown on Hong Kong is something that cannot be ignored. The national security law was an assertion of sovereignty and a deliberate and systematic attempt to stamp out the protests, political expression, and the remnants of democratic representation in Hong Kong. The act eviscerated the one country, two systems international agreement. And what is interesting about that sorry event is the extreme extraterritoriality of the national security law. Article 38 states that the NSL not only covers anyone in Hong Kong, regardless of nationality or residency status, it also applies to offenses from outside the region by a person who is not a permanent resident. I know from personal experience that discussion groups of Hong Kong diaspora on WhatsApp and other non-Chinese platforms, which had been actively debating the Hong Kong protests, suddenly fell silent because of this intimidation. Just as the US tried to leverage chips to achieve global leverage, China understands that controlling speech, asserting sovereignty over cyberspace, requires a global reach. I suspect that China's treatment of Hong Kong has increased Europe's reluctance to work with Chinese enterprises, and of course is easily used as a justification for the American blockade. So China starts to face the harsh reality of a sovereigntist internet. Insofar as it succeeds in creating one, its own barriers will be matched by those of other countries. So here we have the opposite of what happened with Europe and GDPR. Instead of a de facto harmonization and convergence on principles, norms, and rules, we see a serious fracturing, a dangerous fracturing. The world's two biggest economies and two biggest military powers have discovered that sovereignty in cyberspace is mutually exclusive. There can be only one. Neither seems likely to back down. And yet, the future of a globally compatible and interconnected internet depends heavily upon U.S. China relations. If the U.S. and China cannot maintain an integrated digital economy, who can? We may very well evolve into a truly fragmented world information and communications environment. This will not happen because of the so-called new IP initiative of Huawei. We have recently published some materials exposing this, not exactly as vaporware, but as something very, very far away from being an alternative protocol that's going to replace IP. But longer term, this digital conflict could very well lead in that direction. Going down this road could undo the great revolution in global interoperability that occurred in the 1990s with the victory of Internet Protocol. So 4 years ago, I did not foresee the degree to which content on social media platforms would be militarized by nation-state directed influence operations. That process does, however, fit neatly into the alignment thesis and also exhibits the jurisdictional paradox. The idea of information warfare and disinformation have created a linkage between content and cybersecurity. This is new and problematic. Prior to 2015, the US and other liberal democracies supported an understanding of cybersecurity that focused on the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information systems and data. There was an understanding that definitions of information security that included the meaning and content of messages could be used to justify censorship and could clash with Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Only authoritarian countries define security in a way that involves shielding their territory from critical or external messages. That liberal approach was evident in the West's reaction to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's Code of Conduct for State Behavior in Information Security. The SCO is, of course, a Eurasian political, economic, and security alliance led by China and Russia. Its original 2011 draft of the code included a commitment to, quote, cooperate in curbing the dissemination of information that incites terrorism, secessionism, or extremism, or that undermines other countries' political, economic, and social stability, as well as their spiritual and cultural environment. So when this code of conduct was placed before the United Nations in 2012, the U.S. State Department issued a statement claiming that the draft code legitimized the view that the right to freedom of expression can be limited by national laws and cultural proclivities, thereby undermining that right as described in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But the U.S. view has changed dramatically. The election of 2016 fueled a form of partisan politics that exaggerated the impact of Russian influence operations on American society. As a result, ironically, every policy and doctrinal move the U.S. has made since 2016 basically affirms the principles and norms in the SCO's original approach to information security. For example, the President's 2017 National Security Strategy and the 2018 National Defense Strategy contain multiple references to, quote, political and information subversion and, quote, foreign propaganda that threatens our cultural and political values, just as in the SCO Code of Conduct. I see here a major shift in cyber norms in the West. There is not only a nostalgia for territorialized media and its gatekeepers, but a more disturbing loss of confidence in liberal democracy, that is, in the ability of people to separate truth from fiction in an open and free information environment. That loss of confidence is fueled by the left as much as the right. Pushed by various interest groups, including old media, the liberal state evinces a defensiveness, a feeling of vulnerability to the dramatically scaled up global capabilities for information exchange created by the platforms. The US government's reaction to TikTok's success took these politicized spheres to new and absurd heights. A frivolous app was declared a national emergency, literally, a national emergency by executive order, and demonized as a form of espionage, propaganda, and censorship. The US government seemed either entirely unaware of or completely unembarrassed by their imitation of China's methods of blocking apps. While authoritarians look to the state to try to border their information space, the more liberal societies increasingly look to the platform operators themselves to govern content, even as they claim that the platforms are too big, have too much power, are addictive, are politically biased, or whatever. And so we get shifty forms of public-private power, which will, in my view, cement the dominance of established platforms and subordinate their content decisions to geopolitical competition. Isn't it interesting that in the US, the private platforms' detections of coordinated inauthentic activity seem to mirror their own nation states' geopolitical adversaries, Iran, Russia, and China. That becomes problematic when the platform is global and reaches into the populations of other states. A number of initiatives, however, are globalizing content moderation, such as the Christchurch Call, the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, and an OECD initiative to standardize the reporting of terrorist content. Both the European Union and the Christchurch call seem to be pushing for mandatory upload filters, an algorithm-driven prior restraint on speech that will be riddled with false positives. Even as antitrust authorities target the platforms, the same governments leverage and reinforce their dominance in order to advance their content regulation objectives. So let me wrap up with some key takeaways, and hopefully we will have some interesting discussions, time for it. There's a tension between global cyberspace and territorial sovereignty. I basically think that they are fundamentally incompatible, and we need to recognize this. We need to understand the way that incompatibility is a major driver of the problems of internet governance. I want to emphasize that the factors driving this struggle are structural. Although Trump inflamed these problems in the way that he is uniquely capable of, they are not caused by him. They did not start with him, nor will they go away with his absence. Cyberspace is a global commons that requires loose, cooperative, and decentralized forms of governance to maintain its key benefits. We need to nurture and preserve this system, not destroy it. Calls for digital sovereignty or any other form of sovereignty over cyberspace will, in fact, destroy it, given enough time. To securitize information and communication technology is to plunge the global information economy into an anarchic war of all states against all others. It takes us down a rabbit hole that can only lead to hierarchical dominance or dominance over a digital island, a dominance of a global sovereign. Take your pick. The future of liberal democracy may very well depend on how we handle the internet governance problems, and that in turn relies on finding effective governance institutions that are global, multi-stakeholder, and supersede the sovereign state. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Milton. That was evocative and very interesting. Maybe I can start with a first question, sort of relating to your last slide, where you say, okay, we need to recognize the internet as a global commons. And before, in your speech, you gave some examples of that happening before. You referred to the high seas. You referred to outer space. If we take the high seas, for example, that talking about that in terms of grootjes started in the 16th century, and we had a treaty in 1965, I think, something like that. So historically, for humankind, or for states to be more accurate, to relinquish something as being a global common takes some time. And if you look at outer space and you look at the high seas, they are infrastructural and they do not really carry content the way the internet does. So your last point, sort of about the emergent problem of content and content control, not just for authoritarian states, but also increasingly for Western states, will probably not make it easier to get to those global commons. So how would you say, how would a trajectory like that look, or how would you make that idea more palatable to states who have all these worries on their mind, which will block their view on why this is or is not a good idea?
Well, authoritarian states are always going to want to erect barriers to communication. So the only way to overcome that is for their people to gradually struggle with them and extract or decentralize or undermine their authoritarian power. And for the liberal democracies, I think we need to do some thinking about the actual threat, if there is a threat, let me back up and say, what does it mean to have a transnational public sphere? And what are the contradictions and problems associated with being open and having a free information environment, while at the same time your authoritarian rivals do not? I think that's a very interesting problem, and we need to think about it. but I can see a legitimate role for cyber defense in terms of actively identifying coordinated inauthentic activity by nation states, for flagging it and making us aware of it, and in some cases, you know, disabling it if it is indeed disruptive and doing things that are undermining rational public discourse. So I think we've gone a little bit too far, however, in which, you know, we are looking to platform content moderation to erase from existence all forms of social deviance, all forms of bad behavior, all bad ideas, all racist language, and this is just crazy. I mean, sometimes we need to see these things. For one thing, you know, if you're talking about some small, you know, QAnon type group of conspiracy theorists, I would rather have them openly visible, operating on a platform, than not, you know, than suppressing them and telling them to go hide out in ever deeper holes where they cannot be seen and cannot be held accountable for what they do.
Okay, maybe adding on to that from one of the questions in the live chat, you've talked sort of about sovereignty historically as being a very malleable concept, right? So it sort of fits whoever, so it sort of fits the powerful, basically. And the question by Serene is, okay, would you suggest reinventing or redefining sovereignty as a concept, specifically for cyberspace, or apply the existing concept as it is? So in other words, what kind of room to maneuver is there to apply a concept that is very foundational, even in a mummy form, if you like, for international lawyers and diplomats to look at the world? Is there a way to make it malleable so that states to a certain extent can have their cake and eat it, right? So to have this substructure in place and then still have some form of sovereignty that they would like?
No, I think that's exactly what I'm saying we shouldn't do. This idea, whether it's the Tallinn Manual or similar efforts to define sovereignty in cyberspace, it's just, no, let's understand that they are conceptually, politically, and technically mutually exclusive concepts with a global cyberspace. And I don't understand why this is such a problem. We surrender sovereignty over the high seas. We surrender sovereignty over outer space. We have de facto no sovereignty over cyberspace. I mean, it grew independently of states and within the ecosystem created by a liberalized trading order. But no, I don't want to give states any ability to cling to the idea that the traditional notion of sovereignty can be salvaged as it applies to cyberspace. The point is, sovereignty as it evolved, I described it not as just totally a power grab, but as a economies of scale and governance, right? So think of the weights and standards that were created by the consolidation of authority over France, for example. It facilitated markets, it facilitated coordination, and think of the expansion of state territory that came with the rise of railroads and the consolidation of Germany into a large nation state instead of a bunch of fragmented principalities. That's all, you know, parts of that process could be brutal, but on the other hand, it made a lot of sense. But it makes no sense to try to apply those concepts of territorial boundaries, which can in fact be a peaceful thing. If you're saying, okay, now we know where your authority ends and mine begins, and we're not going to fight over that anymore because we have a border here, and I have sovereignty on this side and you have it on that side. You can't do that in cyberspace. It's too interdependent and interacting.
Okay, I want to go to a question by Daniel Lambert of the University of Frankfurt. who says, okay, so the argument seems to rest on a view of cyberspace as a network that lies beyond territory, right? So it's detached from the real world, basically, albeit connected at nodes, etc. And therefore it's incompatible with sovereignty. But he's saying, okay, but the digital world and the real world are becoming more enmeshed, actually, through ubiquitous commuting, smartphones, etc. So more and more, the internet or cyberspace is creeping into all the nooks and crannies of our day-to-day life. So would we not be better served with an approach towards cyberspace that sees it as part of the world rather than distinct from it? And I think this is sort of coming from the really early conceptions of cyberspace as a new free space, devoid of sovereignty, so the Perry Barlow kind of notions. But because it's becoming so enmeshed with daily lives, shouldn't we have a different kind of conception of what cyberspace is?
No, I don't think so. I don't think my conception of cyberspace is a Barlow-esque statement that it's a realm of the mind that is somehow detached from the rest of the world. I don't think that's the case at all. Any more than than outer space is, I mean, you could say that's detached from the world in a physical sense, but I mean, it's part of the world, right? And so much of what we do depends on satellites beaming information up and down between the world, but we don't try to govern it based on territorial notions. And so what we have is a software-defined space. So yeah, you can obtain leverage over what happens in cyberspace to some extent by controlling, pieces of equipment in your territory, although that is limited because once they're connected, they are constantly interacting with devices in no time, and simultaneously they are interacting with devices that are all over the world and in outer space and on the ocean. So the fact that some of these services, let's take something very very intimate and physical, that is to say, let's say health information and health services in hospitals, right? So obviously there's a very physical and territorial aspect to being treated medically, but who cares if the information comes from your county or your state or even your nation, as long as it's properly protected and handled, right? That what matters is the nature of the access to and treatment and processing of the data rather than its territoriality. And if we can develop major medical advances by shipping information around all over the place all the time, why not?
All right. I will have two questions connected to China, but very different. So Joe Burton is basically asking, so why are the restrictions on Huawei comparable to the U.S. oil embargo on Japan? And the underlying question there is, okay, does China shoulder any responsibility for the way its technology and platforms are perceived? So different from how they are, but how they are perceived. Another one from Rogier Kramers, who is turning to the other side of the story, more the information warfare side of it, asking, okay, he's a China scholar. He doesn't see much room for China turning liberal when it comes to free speech. So how do we deal with these kind of realities where we have authoritarian regimes who are both technologically able and very politically keen on restricting cyberspace as a space for free speech? If that is a given, basically, for the foreseeable future, how would that impact? How should that impact our own reaction in this sphere, basically?
All right. The second question is very interesting and good one, having to do with this lack of reciprocity that I talked about earlier. I'll save that for later, but on the Japanese embargo, I don't know, it seems pretty obvious to me that we embargoed, the Japanese were a rising empire that was becoming aggressive and militaristic, and the United States had kind of a dominance of oil and gas markets. And we decided, knowing, by the way, that this would probably draw us into the war, which some people wanted, we decided to cut them off from oil supplies. Right? I mean, and so that's exactly what we're doing with chips. Even though China at the present time, as bad as it is as domestically, is not invading other countries and doesn't have quite the same imperialistic profile as Japan in the 1930s. Now, the other question is a very profound one, and I think, like I say, that's why the future of liberal democracy really depends on finding the right approach to global governance of information and communications and normal forms of territorial governance. You know, I think, you know, you don't have to believe that China is miraculously going to turn into democratic liberals if they engage with us. Really has never been. I mean, I wrote a book about China in the information age in 1996, and it was clear to me then that what they were doing was exploiting market forces while retaining a communist party dictatorship or one-party state. And this was very clear, and that they had no intention, you know, if there were any doubts, you know, Tiananmen Square settled them in terms of how they were going about this development process. So the question, however, is if you go to China today, and if you went there, you know, when I started going in the early 90s or in the 80s, you know, you see that economic development does create interdependencies with the Western world that does constrain their behavior in important ways. And so even though you're not going to liberate the Uyghurs, you're not going to, you know, suddenly turn them into, you know, the Netherlands. Their continued engagement through trade and commerce and transportation is extremely important in moderating and gradually evolving their system of governance. And do not underestimate the ability of the Chinese people to sort of stand up for their rights eventually. I think that will happen. It just, as they become wealthier and you know, they will become a little more demanding of what they expect from their government.
That's a huge and interesting debate in itself, I think. I'm having a beep here. Okay, it's gone. And one question, I'm going to use my privilege to extend this a little bit further because we started a little late because of technical problems on our side. I have one question by Florian Egloff, which I think is interesting. I don't know of the proposal itself. Perhaps you do. He's talking about the proposals like Zion that abandon BGP, so Border Gateway Protocol for routing, and instead create deterministic routing and trust zones. So basically interfering in this deep layer of the internet to create a trusted zone for traffic, I suppose. Are you familiar with this proposal?
I'm not. The name of it was Zion.
Yeah.
I mean, there's been a debate about deterministic routing in connection with the so-called new IP by Huawei, and there's been various discussions of that. But I'm not familiar with this particular proposal, no.
Okay, maybe broaden the point out. Do you know of any, and I think you already answered it slightly, but do you know of any proposals out there that sort of would touch on these deeper layers of the internet in terms of creating different zones that are out there that are actually viable in the medium term?
Well, the most interesting recent developments in internet standards have to do with encrypting parts of it and increasing the security of it. So there are some attempts to solve the security problems of BGP. BGP-SEC is probably a disaster that will never go anywhere, but RPKI is basically authenticating the address block announcements in routing, which is an important form of added security. More interesting is the DNS over HTTPS and TLS 1.3. We see here encryption standards and that are extending to new elements of the internet. So not only does DNS over HTTPS sort of shelter or protect the DNS queries, but it also bypasses or has a potential to bypass, if you wanted to, the DNS resolution of the internet service provider. So some people are concerned about the impact on market structure. In fact, we have a IGF workshop on this tomorrow, where we'll be talking about the changes in market control or market concentration caused or not caused by DNS over DOH, as we call it, DOH. But it's been interesting to see when you introduce these security technologies, you disrupt power relations as well. Not in the way that some human rights advocates have been saying, oh, you can hardwire human rights into the protocol. No, that doesn't happen. What happens, for example, TLS 1.3 is now being rejected by Russia and China in certain ways. And there's a debate about its adaptation and adoption even within private industry because it makes internal network traffic non-transparent. And some companies think that undermines their security. But what does happen is, the control points might shift in the implementation. So it might be suddenly that like I say, your internal network has less control over what's going on, less visibility into what's going on, and that means the users have more freedom. Or with DOH, it means that the control point is shifted from the ISP to the browser manufacturer, and the browsers have more access to data than the ISPs.
Okay. So technological innovations like this have shifts in power control. I have one question left, and because you made a fairly firm statement about international law and international lawyers, I see one in there, so I think the privilege should go to that question. And the question is by Pia from the University of Glasgow. So if state sovereignty doesn't apply to cyberspace because it were to be a global commons, then how can states react to cyber operations that are held against them below the threshold of force? Because normally we would say sovereignty is violated. If it's a global commons, then you take that away. Then how can a state legitimately, I'm guessing that's the reaction, how can a state legitimately within international law react to such a case? So how would you, because it's basically, how does it fit onto each other, right? If it's a global commons, is it then a legal void?
That's a problem for the international lawyers, not for me, because what they have discovered every time they delve into it is that, this cyber operation really doesn't meet the threshold of an act of force. And so you can't say that it's a violation of their sovereignty. It's just some kind of influence or some kind of under the threshold activity. So they need to tell us how sovereignty applies to that, and they typically can't, So, but I would say that let's suppose that I do a cyber operation that completely corrupts the electoral machinery of the Netherlands, and I determine the winner of the parliamentary elections. That is a clear violation of sovereignty of the Netherlands, not of cyberspace. You don't have to assert sovereignty over cyberspace to tell that you have a right to protect the integrity of your fundamental political processes. That's kind of a confused notion. So there are things that actually do affect your sovereignty, and they could be executed through cyber means. But you're not trying to assert sovereignty over cyberspace or over a piece of cyberspace. You're simply defending your sovereignty.
I think that is a very clear answer. Thank you very much. So we're running late. We're a little bit over time. It's been a long day for the people tuning in to our conference today. I want to thank you very much, Milton, for an energetic keynote and a good debate. As you can see in the Q&A, there's a bunch of questions we have missed, but we'll meet again in different places to discuss. Thank you very much. Have a nice day, and I hope to see you in real life soon. Thank you all for tuning in today. Thank you for joining us. This concludes our sessions for today. Tomorrow will be our last day of our conference. You are all very much invited to join. We're starting with a keynote in the morning by Maria Rosaria Tadeu of Oxford University. We'll have a panel on international law, so Milton will be keen to join that, I think. A panel on global cyber norms, and we'll end with a keynote by Bruce Schneier. And thank you all very much for joining us today. Hope to see you tomorrow. Have a good evening, morning, day, afternoon, for wherever you are. Thank you.